Well, small businesses, and particularly township businesses, are key to reviving South Africa's economy and minimizing unemployment. But barriers to access to entry and challenges in accessing finance are a deterrent for some would-be entrepreneurs. Joining me now to talk about removing red tape and supporting SMMEs is Divisional Executive for Venture Capital and Corporate Finance at the National Empowerment Foundation, Zama Khanyile, as well as the Executive Director at Zivoli Growth Partners, Mpupi Kupe. And of course, you're a part of this conversation tonight. WhatsApp your questions and comments, 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us at Newzroom 405 if you wish to give in a question or a comment tonight to this conversation. Ladies, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus to talk about this very important conversation, of course, that ties into all the other challenges that the country has got to deal with, particularly in creating employment. Now, the economic cost of time and resources committed to compliance, one would say, surely to an extent, is crippling to big business. How much more is this being felt by small businesses? Mpupi?
Yes, good evening, and thank you for having me. So, yeah, absolutely. I think small businesses bear the brunt of compliance the most because it does tend to be onerous for them because they don't have the luxury of a team that can help them with that specifically. So it tends to fall on the shoulders of the entrepreneur. So certainly it does pose as a challenge. I don't know that I would use the word hindrance because it's almost a necessary license to trade. Particularly when you're looking for funding, etc. So I think for me, what the problem that we should be solving for is how do we make it more accessible and more affordable for small businesses to still meet the requirements? Because at a maintenance level, it would almost be irresponsible to not to do business with a company that doesn't demonstrate a certain level of compliance. But it certainly shouldn't then also achieve the opposite, which is to hinder small businesses from paying attention to what's core to their offering, which is certainly not compliance.
Yeah, certainly. Zama, what is your perspective on the economic significance of small businesses and the regulatory compliance requirements that they face?
Certainly, the township economy is so pivotal to the overall broader South African economy. I mean, the events of July, the unrest that we saw and the impact thereof, I think, put at the center of all of our minds the importance and the critical nature to have a thriving and active township economy. But on the compliance aspect, I agree with Mpupi. And from a government perspective, I want to say that we have been more agile. You know, there's been pros and cons brought on by COVID. But in the same breath, it's helped us to relook and repivot. That was the buzzword. And out of that, you know, more streamlined processes that are enabling to bring in more SMEs into the fold is what we saw transforming across the NEF and other development funding institutions. So we've been agile and to the extent that, you know, we sit more frequently now in terms of our investment committee meetings, at least twice a week to consider transactions. We've shortened the processes behind transactions. We're not cutting corners, but we've streamlined our processes because we had this opportunity to reflect and think, really, how can we do things better? And to that effect, we've approved, you know, funding for close to 140 business operations across South Africa with 830 million in a short space of time, all in an effort to rebuild this very important and very critical aspect of our economy, which is the township economy and the rural economy.
Yeah. President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking in KwaZulu-Natal, he says if we really want economic development, we must cut out red tape. We must make sure that things happen. He says, adding to that, saying, I am aware of a lackadaisic tendency to documents and that they are not always being processed quickly by the relevant channels in government, right? And we've been talking about red tape, maybe changing it to some degree and saying ease of doing business, but apparently there are intellectual property issues around using that particular name. So I heard they're saying in one of the parliament meetings, so we're back to talking about red tape now. But I mean, it's only what? now in December or maybe at the beginning of 2021 that, for example, this whole issue of business licenses has now been handed over to the Department of Small Business Development as opposed to sitting at the Trade and Industry? It's just taking so long. Why are the wheels turning so slowly, Mpupi?
Sure, that's a layered question. So I think for me, I always say, COVID was unexpected and the consequences of it have been felt very widely. But what it has done, and I suppose it's the nature of any pandemic or any big shift that is imposed.
Oh dear. We seem to have lost Mpupi there. I hope it's not load shedding. Of course, it has started, and this is part of the difficulties when it comes to doing business. Of course, having to lose power mid-air, having a conversation. Well, at this particular point, we seem to be having that challenge. We'll try and get Mpupi back on. We have Zama Khanyile from the National Empowerment Foundation, as well as Mpupi there, Kupe with us, trying to navigate this conversation. To some degree, yes, we agree that red tape is, of course, necessary, particularly to protect consumers and to ensure that there is order in the commercial activity. But what is it that we can do to shift the regulatory policies to work for SMMEs? And Mpupi, I think you're back with us there for a moment. We had a moment of load shedding. Yes, you were saying it's quite layered in a sense to be able to pin it down as to why it's taken so long. However, COVID has exposed a lot of things and seemingly has fast-tracked certain processes.
Yes, absolutely. So, as I said, the bad news is COVID was what it was. And the good news is, we almost rise in adversity. And we recognize opportunities for, as Zama was saying, to be more seamless, to be more responsive, to act faster, because we're now responding to this pandemic. So it certainly has made us more aware of the issues that we know always existed. But I suppose because things were okay economically, and we didn't necessarily have the urge to prioritize. And now that we're collectively in a mode of stimulating the economy and resuscitating businesses, we are all now having a common objective of saying we cannot go on like this because we're aware of where the shortcomings are in the historical approaches. How do we start to make it more efficient? And coupled with that, if I can go back to the previous question, and what we're finding is that access to information and the ability to demonstrate compliance on the requirements that would be asked for by the likes of NEF, suddenly there's a lot more access, and not just around how do I obtain my tax clearance certificate, but how do I gain a knowledge and understanding of ensuring that I'm able to then maintain continuously being compliant, which previously you may have relied on an external person and would have come as a cost. Now the SMEs themselves are becoming increasingly more empowered to be able to act on some of these themselves, instead of going externally at a cost and also at a time horizon that might not be conducive.
So the Department of Small Business Development has prioritized a number of things, but key amongst the issues, Mpupi, that they've prioritized is to fast-track the rollout of infrastructure like incubators and digital hubs. Now, I had a mining and labor market analyst earlier on saying, this thing of incubators and digital hubs sounds a little bit elitist, right? Particularly if you're talking to people in rural areas, because they don't have access to these things. Not a lot of people are exposed, for example, to NEF's programs or to CFA's programs or to CEDA's programs in rural parts of South Africa. We're having a challenge. I mean, even though we are prioritizing that, it doesn't seem to be wide enough. So it's a question of footprint.
It is, and I'm going to answer the question twofold. So I appreciate that access to particularly anything that's digital, it becomes less so the further you go away from urban. But we work with a lot of SMEs in rural townships and peri-urban communities. And I've always challenged this notion because the average person in South Africa has a smartphone, and they have WhatsApp and other platforms that consume data. So I find that sometimes the problem statement that we put on the table is not necessarily the accurate one. I agree that we need to assist and support these SMEs in navigating other digital platforms. But that's more awareness than a lack of the infrastructure. So in other words, a lot of information sharing has moved away from I need to meet with you in person or you need to have a laptop to you can join a webinar, et cetera, on your phone. What we need to focus on, and I completely agree, is what does reach look like and what does access look like? Is it a matter of how far have I gone, or is it a matter of how far have I gone and in what language am I offering this and on what platforms does it sit? I certainly think we can do better at that, and we must do better at that because we're seeing that in urban and to some extent township, information is reaching those SMEs. But the further away you go from urban communities, it's less true. So I think for me, the question is, how do we make it more accessible in those areas without necessarily changing the channels that we're utilizing? Because if something is sitting on somebody's phone, and it could be as simple as we're not going to have a Zoom meeting, but we're going to rather disseminate this through WhatsApp. It's the how for me that we need to master. But the work is happening because we're seeing the successes in your urbans and your townships. Let's take that blueprint and modify it so that it becomes more suitable for other communities.
Zama, we'll come back to you and give you a chance to weigh in on that. The footprint of FDI is a big problem that is being cited. Let's get your views tonight. If you run your own business in your own locality, what are those big major challenges, particularly in shifting the bureaucratic red tape that you think should be addressed? Of course, we'll hear more of what came out of that midterm budget statement by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwane around who else needs to be playing in this ecosystem to ensure a success of small businesses. Stay with us. In Focus comes back in a moment.
Government cannot drive economic recovery and growth alone because most areas of economic activity are dominated by the private sector, including investment, employment, and innovation. In this, we strongly call on greater social compact to raise growth and improve livelihoods.
That's the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwane. They're talking on the role players that need to assist in this recovery. We'll talk a little bit more about innovation. But Zama, let's bring you in. I mean, if we agree that our small, medium and micro enterprise support plan is anchored in township and rural entrepreneurship, why does NEF not have offices in the townships, right? Why do I have to go on a taxi? It's going to cost me more, and I still need to print documents. It's just burdensome, really, on a small business.
Thank you for that question. And so it's really important when we talk about access to information that we, particularly as governments, we create the access to information. So we do have a regional footprint as the National Empowerment Fund. So we're present in all of the provinces. But what we are most proud of, because our mandate says that we must promote broad-based Black economic empowerment, it is actually then our duty to make sure that the township community is part of that and the rural economy is part of that as well. And so we've come up a couple of years ago, because this is such an important aspect of our mandate, with our roadshows that go around to various community halls. And through that, we've been able to touch more than 3.6 million South Africans, you know, creating awareness about finance on the one end, but also appreciating that we do need to just create a level of financial literacy across, you know, the Black communities in the various provinces, townships, and rural areas. So we've got this program where we really help, first and foremost, Black people in the townships and rural communities to understand how to further stretch their rand by, you know, promoting a culture of savings and investment through these community seminars. But we also have dedicated entrepreneurship training forums that at the end, you know, somebody from the township is given an opportunity to pitch in front of the professionals and see, you know, whether they are able to package their business proposal, the why, the finances behind it, and so forth. And we are proud to say we've, you know, trained up more than 4,800 would-be entrepreneurs in this space. And so I want to also piggyback on what Pupi was mentioning. You know, accessibility, you know, it cuts across. It's about data, connectivity. It's about physical presence. But it's also about availing information in a way that is easy to consume. So what we do to try and explain some of these so-called more complex financial terms, we'll do what we call an industrial play or a production that then makes the content of how to engage with financiers that much more accessible, and people then find the right language to communicate to you what it is they're trying to do and what it is that they need funding for. So we've gone as far as with our business planner tool. It's available online, but if you've got connectivity issues, you can download it. As Gupi said, most people do have smartphones that they access, other people and the internet and so forth through. But we've made sure that the prompters and the guidance is not only available in English, so it's available across all the official languages so that people can really get their assistance in a way that they can best understand it.
Yeah. It might not be yourself, but certainly it's one of the financial development finance institutions that was reporting in Parliament. I think it was CIFA, who have got a micro loan. But even in that micro loan, right, their approval rate is 48%, which means over 50% of people who need to be accessing that money are not getting it. Why is it that in 2020 we still have such a low approval rate? Is there something that needs to happen with the funding policies that are seemingly an impediment for at least 50% of those being left out?
Is that for me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, thank you. So, yes, the throughput rate is something that every DFI is mindful of. And the question is, what happens to the portion of the applicants that, do not qualify, are not ready for funding? And that's where strategic partnerships and working together with the likes of your CDA and your development agencies nationally, even on a regional level, to help those entrepreneurs in packaging the submission better and, giving them the right tools to be able to rework their submission and come back. And I want to debunk the myth about, the complication or incubation sounds like this fancy term, because there is a space for it in the market where somebody is sitting on a good idea, but at that point in time, it is just not ready for one or two reasons. And incubation comes in seamlessly to support and provide that bridge to make those ideas now, more fundable, so that the DFIs can play their role in supporting them. And we do also work closely with a number of incubators and accelerators who help us then just improve that approval record.
Yeah. Have you standardized, for example, your business plan? Are they using the same template if they go anywhere in any of those DFIs?
Sure. So you're actually touching my heart because our business planner tool that I was referring to, that's available for, with prompters in the various official languages, that's not a tool that is purely for NEF clients. So you could take that application of yours, in fact, it tells you the level of readiness, so that as you're compiling it, maybe I'm missing information on the marketing aspect, on the technical aspect, and then it helps you build a financial model as well. So at the end, it tells you the level of completeness of your application, so that you're not surprised when you take your application to a DFI and there are perhaps gaps in terms of critical information that should be there on day one. We do have a standardized application form. It is online, but we do keep physical copies that we go out and hand out to our stakeholders, along with an information pack that really helps guide them on how to put together this information package. So once the business planner tool says, you're 100% complete, that's an application you can take to any other financiers, even the banks, because you would stand the test in terms of having completed the core aspects of what a financier needs to see for them to assess an application for funding.
Right. Let's stay with the funding policy a little bit more, but I'll let you breathe. Let's bring Mpupi in. And the funding policy, when we talk about this, a lot of people, for example, talk about this question of having skin in the game and say this 10% is too high for a startup, for example. In 2018, we were talking about startups not even going past the first year. The Department of Small Business Development saying they've been working with that. Now we are probably more talking about not going past the first 3 to 5 years, but we need to also improve on that. This 10%, is it an inhibitor? Is it something that we need to waiver?
So it really depends on the type of funding that you're going after. And I want to speak about the idea of a percentage. So that's a risk mitigation, right, on the part of the financier. But for me, it's really informed by, again, the type of funding that you're going for. I think what we need is a wider range of types of funding. The problem with that, of course, is the riskier the investment, you're likely to be going after money where the financier wants to take equity. So there's also going to be a receptiveness on the part of the SME that you're likely to need to give up a bigger percentage of your equity to compensate for the inability to put down some sort of collateral or some sort of deposit. I do think, though, that in the space of funding ideas, so early stage businesses or somebody generally who just has a really great idea, I don't think we have enough funding vehicles. And I think that's the space that the SMEs that are finding that they're not getting funding in the traditional vehicles that are available, they could do with that space. So we are seeing, though, that your venture capital providers are growing in number. What we're not seeing is that they are growing in appetite to take more risk in earlier stage businesses. It's a gap that still needs to be closed, but I'm finding the more we mature in understanding the end-to-end funding vehicles that ideally as a country we should have, the more there's appetite to take on risk. So it's not true of what's available in the market today, but it's increasingly becoming more true. And I think we're going to get better at it in a year or 2 years. And also in the context of coming out of COVID as well. There's other channels that are coming onto the market that are demonstrating a willingness to take on more risk and to give shorter-term debt or lower-value debt that one would otherwise not have been able to access. So the market is evolving. It might not be evolving at the pace that we desire, but I remember there was a time not too long ago that your only option was your retail banks, as an example, and in some cases your DFIs. But the requirements were similar in nature. So if you were not going to get the funding at the bank, yes, there'll be some leniency on the part of the DFIs, but not to the level that is required to fund early stage businesses. I don't think that's still true today. There are many more vehicles, but they are not sufficient to fulfill the appetite of the market.
Let's talk then about how do we fix access to market, because I mean it's good and well that you will have a product, but if you don't have sufficient places to be able to sell that product, you might as well close shop. Now they've, for example, come up with an idea of targeted import replacement to support localization. I mean, for me, that's code to say, well, we can't just cut all imports. So let's target certain things. And where do we go? And why are we treading so lightly on that particular issue? Because some entrepreneurs will say, well, I've got lots of product here, but the imports are killing the market.
Yeah, so I think it has to be a dual approach, right? So there is the approach of saying, how do we localize better and create a market for local businesses, big and small, at the expense of the imports that are currently coming into the market. That's a very different problem statement for me to the problem statement of saying we've got a lot of frustrated SMEs that are not getting sufficient access to market. And I want to speak to the latter. So for us, the way we support SMEs and enable them to get access to markets is firstly to understand and engage our corporate clients to ring-fence opportunities or to ring-fence as a portion of their spend. And then the onus is then on your ESD practitioners and any other players, the likes of the NEF, to present to these corporates competent, capable SMEs that the corporate can vouch for and therefore afford that opportunity. I find for me the needle is moving more on the access to market for SMEs than to the extent that we want on the how do we start to localize at volume so that we see the impact and benefit for local businesses, big and small, against the imports that are currently flooding the market. We need to almost pick the battle where we think we're going to win the quickest. And I suppose maybe it's also influenced by the fact that I'm in this space. But we do see the wins when it comes to access to markets for SMEs. But it's a joint conversation with corporate around commit to giving them the opportunities and will commit to bringing you the right SMEs. And that marriage is happening more and more because there's receptiveness on the part of the corporate to participate in solving this problem. I think the imports one is a slightly more complicated one because we're talking about scale, because we're talking about price and quality. So it might not feel like the needle is moving sufficiently. But I also think it's a complex problem that you're solving versus the example that I was giving.
We'll get Zama to weigh in on that. Zama Khanyile from the NEF. We also have Mpupi Kupe from Zivoli Growth Partners. And of course, we're taking your thoughts as well tonight. 072-110-5584. Being an entrepreneur, what are the challenges? What needs to shift in as far as our regulatory framework is concerned to allow for ease of doing business for you in your locality? 072-110-5584 or tweet us at Newzroom405. In Focus continues shortly.
We introduced a loan guarantee scheme which enabled commercial banks to support firms in distress as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. This program has been concluded. In its place, we are considering a new business support measure to enable affected businesses to bounce back. This will be done by providing expanded funding options, broadening the types of financial institutions we can provide this function to include DFIs and non-banks. We are working closely with the South African Reserve Bank, the Banking Association, and other stakeholders to finalize this proposal. Further details will be announced shortly.
Well, there you are, proposal from Treasury of more DFIs, or at least non-banks, to be able to assist businesses, particularly hard hit because of COVID, but also coming out of the unrest in July. Let's look at some of your WhatsApp messages tonight to the conversation and what your challenges are. From Mandla in Berlin, Evening Table, government screams about empowering youth and that there are funds available, but when we follow up on that, they are met with a lot of red tape, with multiple requirements that do not make sense and are very impossible to have simply because one is a small business or they are only a startup. Let's get Zama just to respond to that, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about access to market. But here's a frustrated young person saying, you talk about these things. When we come to you, you're making us jump through hoops. Do you find there is still a lack of skills and understanding, or as we put it earlier, a lack of information as to what is required? What makes it so difficult for young people to have access to this finance?
Sure. I mean, I hear the plea and I hear the complaint, from that message, where there's a young, bright individual who feels perhaps frustrated or left out of participating in the economy because of these requirements. So I think, one, we must understand that, the principles of responsible lending mean that there are certain things that must be there up front. The NEF handles monies that is allocated from its shareholder ministry, the DTIC, and through other forums. And so each rand that goes out, really we must have the utmost certainty that we'll be able to get that money back so that we can recycle it and support more female-owned, more youth-owned businesses. So I think I'd like to send a message of encouragement. As the NEF, we have funded more than 1,230 businesses. So there are people who have walked the journey, and I don't want your viewer to feel disheartened. I think let them come to us and let's talk, because at the NEF we're very good at hand holding and making sure that you walk the process with us so that we get you to that fundable state.
Yeah,
on the issue of access to markets, I mean, it's very important. So as a financier, we're not looking at just providing a funding solution, but we're looking at the long-term sustainability of the business, because that's the only way we can ensure that we get money back. So we've developed techniques as the NEF to create what we call market linkages, be it with government-owned entities, private sector entities. We're able to knock on their doors and present a business case for Black people to provide into those supply chains of those corporates and government entities. And on Pupi's point about really funding early stages of business development, we've got what we call our strategic projects fund, where we take a concept from concept stage and together we walk the path of figuring out, okay, so here's this concept, who is the market, where is the market, how do we access the market, how do we deliver the right quality products consistently to this market, at what scale, and who else can we get as an institutional investor or a DFI to partner up with us so that we can really bring this project to scale. Yeah. So this is something that is in recent times is referred to as the Black Industrialist Program, but as the NEF for the last 11, 12 years, we've been taking, concepts from idea stage right through to pre-feasibility, to bankable feasibility, and eventually financial close. So I think it's important for the viewer not to be disheartened, and they must take encouragement in the number of Black people that look and sound like them that have been able to walk this journey, and the NEF is always willing to walk the journey through our hand-holding process that is part of our very comprehensive pre-investment initiative.
I wonder, for example, how much of it comes to the fact that sometimes, for example, I'll speak of my own personal experience, you interact with the NEF via a portal that has been created, right, on the internet. You submit all the documents and whatever else that you need to submit, and then you get a letter that regrets, and you're sitting there and you're going, okay, what did I not put in here, right? And you try and follow up on that process, and you find that then you get no joy, but there's nobody who says to you, oh, maybe because this thing is still a new idea, why don't you try this product? It just ends at the fact that, no, you applied for this and you were rejected for it, and now you're sitting saying, okay, what is my next option?
We certainly try with every rejection or decline letter that, one, it is informative, and two, we don't just send it cold, that there's a discussion around what are the critical aspects and what can we help you work on so that you can come back to us at a future date. So I think it's important really to take that guidance, not as this is the end of the road, because our communique never says this is the end of the road. We always say, once you've got 1, 2, 3, please, you're welcome to come back. And if it's something that perhaps doesn't fit within our mandate, we're happy to take your application to one of the banks, to one of the other DFIs, or to recommend you to CEDA, as I'd mentioned earlier on, or through our regional network. Our regional managers have relationship with the local economic development agencies so that we can really help those applicants figure out what to improve so that they can come back, and the doors are always open to reconsider. And so I think I want people to look at it as a hand-holding information sharing process, but we never close the door on our applicants without giving them a solution as to what to improve and where to go.
Here's a challenge for both of you. You might not be able to completely assist this particular caller all the way through, but at least you might be able to give him some kind of advice as to what he needs to do. He'll share his story, and then you'll be able to help. Ken is calling us from Gqeberha. Ken, good evening, and thank you very much for your time. Do share with us what your story is as an entrepreneur.
Good evening, Mr. Mzulu. Last year, July, I started a company. I'm 28 experience in this field. Then I started my own company, then I employed youth. Invested almost 300,000 into this company. And then around about this year, then funding, cash flow was a bit the problem. Then I applied to all these government institutes. Till today, they will tell me, no, we have given this such a bank, your things are okay, then definitely will come back to you. Now it's almost about 6 months without getting any feedback. I'm listening to Ms Zama there saying, oh, we'll help you out. It's the same thing that they tell us, but they don't give us the feedback. Like I'm saying now, I'm 15 months in the industry. Probably by the end of December, if I don't get that funding, I'll just have to close doors. That's the danger about the government funding.
Where have
There's a
you
lot of money
applied,
that
which institutions in particular? Can you be more specific? Where you've got?
FIDA and FIFA.
Right.
I've got my documents in Mpumalanga.
Right. And just if you would elaborate a little bit on your type of business.
I'm into motor industry.
You're in the motor industry.
It's a motor car spare shop. It's quite a big thing. Probably when I started, I was doing about 90,000 a month turnover. And then when the unrest came last year, then it started to drop because I had to close because I didn't have an insurance by then, you know.
Yeah. Then
I'm trying by all avenues. Then you don't get the right thing. When you go send emails, you don't get the feedback from these people. When you call, they reject your call. Call is worse. You don't get an answer from them.
Yeah. All right, Ken, let's take a break. We'll come back and see if Zama and Mpupi have got any suggestions for you on what you need to do there. In Focus continues in a moment. Live tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Africa, channel 405. We have with us Zama Khanyile from the NEF, and we also have Zavoli Growth Partners, Mpupi Kupe. And before we went to the break, Ken called us from Gqeberha, still on the line, of course, talking about the frustrations that he's been dealing with, having invested 300,000 rands into this business, and because of the unrest and the COVID-19 shutdown, having to close his business, but now trying to get funding to be able to get this business going again. Zama, this is one, for me, the lackadaisical tendency to documents and very slow turnaround. I mean, after 6 months, if he still doesn't have a particular answer on where to go, it's really discouraging for him. Unfortunately, he's not an investor with an option to take the money and go elsewhere. He's got to still be in the country. Probably this is a business that is important for him and his livelihood and his family. What does he do?
He can get in touch with me. You know, my email address is khanyilez@nefcorp.co.za. So it's my surname, my initial, co.za. And let's see, you know, how we can help him out. We do fund businesses from a minimum ticket size of 250,000 rand, right up to 75 million rand. We can even go higher than that in terms of project size. We've got relationships with other banks and DFIs where we can co-fund if it is a large enough project. But certainly we can talk to Ken about, you know, his application and how NEF could be of assistance.
Yeah. And what do you do? I know the NEF has got also processes where you actually stay with the business. So you don't just give them money, but you actually almost become involved in the life of the business.
That's very correct. So for our SMEs, we understand some of the challenges. The SMEs owners are very good at the business opportunity. They're very good at executing, but you find sometimes on the back end, the bookkeeping and record keeping is sometimes lacking. So as a standard build on in terms of unlocking value, we provide what we call our back office support. We've got a panel of accountants who then help prepare and keep the financial records of the entities that we've invested in that are in the SME space. And if there's opportunities for growth, we do, through our post-investment units, provide, you know, support interventions at the cost of the NEF, where we pair you up with an industry mentor who can help you strategize around growing your market base, or engineers who can help you, you know, fine-tune your process and efficiencies on the back end. And this is something that NEF does out of its own cost, because we have a vested interest in the success of the businesses that we support. You spoke about collateral and security earlier on. When you're finding in this segment of the market, you don't have that benefit. your only stopgap and form of recovering what you've invested is the cash generated by the business. So we do take a partnership approach. We call it a cradle to grave model, where we really start with you from the beginning to the end. The grave is not necessarily a grave, but it might mean that you've exited us and you're now qualified to go to one of the commercial banks because we de-risk you, we put you at the right scale to qualify.
All right, Ken, well, there you are. You got that email. If not, we'll give you and make sure that you get in touch with Zama. And then we will follow up with you, Ken, and get to find out exactly how far they take you in this process and they're able to assist you. Is that okay?
That's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you so much, Mr. Mdluli. And may you please send it for me on my phone?
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. We'll get the producers to give you that detail. Ken, they're calling us in Quebec. Appreciate that call. What needs to be fixed there, Mpupi? I mean, 6 months before you're able to get a reply to your application. Quite hectic.
Yes, I mean, it is a long waiting period. And you know, if you just look at your typical cash flow projections for the average SME, it certainly does not take them to 6 months of not operating optimally. My suggestion to Ken and to any other entrepreneur is cast your net wide. If you have gone through the trouble of putting together the required documents, apply to multiple channels, both private development funding in private sector, and of course our traditional DFIs. But put your eggs in multiple baskets, because where it's not onerous, it's that you've already got the typical documents that they're asking for. You're just knocking at different doors. Certain channels move faster because they're more agile than others. And you're mitigating that risk around a long turnaround time when you know that you've got your application sitting with various channels. I would like to go to the point that Zama made earlier around the tool that they provide, where you simulate the likelihood, if you will, of how the application is going to go. I think that would be a great start for Ken at this point, right? Because it will start to give him an indication of what went wrong, if anything, without him having to wait for the organizations where he's applied to provide him with feedback, and then use those insights to proactively close those gaps. But again, I would still then take the same application, same documents, and knock on other doors and try and make sure that it's a different type of channels that you're approaching, so that you're not being considered by the same approach, the same methodology, and the same timelines. And when it comes to your application. So I do think that he needs to augment and increase the number of places that he's knocking.
Yeah. What is your perspective and your take on the former Minister of Small Business Development's view on how we define a micro business or an informal business? She says informalization of businesses in South Africa is used to exclude the black majority from participation in the economy. For example, contributions of spaza shops, right, to the economy are by and large always discounted or minimized in some instances where they actually make a huge contribution.
Absolutely. No, it's true. You know, yeah, I think informal tends to be associated with disorganized. And that can be problematic in interpretation, because one can remain informal for various reasons, but it doesn't mean that one shouldn't be afforded the same seriousness, respect, and their contribution be acknowledged in the same manner. The challenge is, I think we tend to speak about formal and informal in the context of access, and the narrative around this notion of access is through the lens of formal. You know, whether I'm accessing funding, whether I'm accessing a procurement opportunity. It does require of one to be formalized in one way or the other. And that then tends to be to the exclusion of those that are informal. We work with a lot of informal and semi-formal, and if you will, businesses. And our view is, when we look at those businesses, we try not to apply the same lens that we would apply to formal. I would like to use a practical example. So we're currently assisting the IDC with SMEs that have been affected by the unrest. And the vast majority of those are informal. So if we were rigid in the requirements for one to qualify for this benefit, we would exclude those naturally because they wouldn't be able to meet our requirements. But we are saying, we're challenging ourselves to say, we've got to take away the stereotype of the notion that there has to be some level of sophistication, formality, and structure for me to be able to give credential or credibility to what you bring into the table. But that's not always applied consistently, which is why you find the bias is to the detriment of the informal, and the benefit is, of course, geared towards the more formal.
Yeah. Zama, you agree with that?
Fully agree with Bobby.
Let's talk then about what you think the amendment to the National Small Enterprise Bill is going to bring for the space of entrepreneurship and small businesses.
I can comment on what I hope it will bring.
Yes.
I'm going to go back to the comment that I made earlier around the types of funding vehicles. We honestly need to do right by informal businesses, cooperatives, and township, almost formal businesses. That, for me, is where the biggest gap lies. And it lies both whether you're talking about access to funding or access to opportunities. We need to change our minds around the expectations that we have that an SME should bring to the table for us to treat them with a necessary degree of seriousness. There are many ways that you can look at credibility and track record, and it shouldn't be confined to what we are accustomed to. And I think that's what's limiting the way we are approaching these businesses. So I think the problem statement should be, how do we unlock for the segment of the market that has been left behind, whether deliberate or otherwise? And the way we do that is to challenge our current mechanisms so that they're appropriate for that segment of the market without forcing them to become something that they're not. So there's an example also that I would like to use. There was a pocket of money that was available for spaza shops for the unrest as well. And the requirements were very interesting to me because we will give you, and I think that particular grant was 3,000 Rand, which for a spaza shop would be very pivotal at that time. But the requirements were almost contradictory to the problem that was being solved. So that marriage really needs to happen without the expectation being, we've got to make the informal formal. Sometimes it is by design, and we shouldn't look at it as a cripple that you're informal and you're not formal. So let's change our minds, let's challenge our thinking, and let's be open-minded around the mechanisms and therefore the ask for the informal versus the formal, or the rural versus the urban. But that, for me, is the big gap, because that's the segment of the market that's constantly being left behind.
Final word from you, Zama. Support for small businesses at a legislative level. What do you hope the National Small Enterprise Amendment Bill will bring?
So, it's important to really be centered around the needs of the ground for the entrepreneurs and the SMEs. And I fully agree with Mbopi. I think different classifications of businesses should help us understand them better and therefore provide a more tailored solution based on where they are and what their needs are, but certainly not to the exclusion of certain segments of the economy, because we all know the informal sector is a big employer of people in our country. You only need to drive through the townships to see the number of early childhood development centers, hair salons, general dealers, and the like that are, on every street and every other corner, to understand the need on the ground to keep these entities alive and to also support them going forward. So I think it's for government to be a little bit more coordinated in terms of how do you fund the whole continuum of entrepreneurs, be they black, be they white, according to size, with the streamlined or an aligned mandates and understanding which role exactly which entity plays, and to do away with so-called silo mentalities, where each DFI or each ministry operates in its own environment, but to better explore synergies, because yes, we can have new legislation, but I want us to not forget about the existing infrastructure that's there, the many platforms that are there to support business. And I think another focus should be, how do we work more cohesively together so that we can deliver these synergies for our SMEs.
Ladies, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Zama Khanyile from the National Empowerment Fund, as well as Mbupi Kupe. She is with the Zavoli Growth Partner.